All right, back to American history. We last time talked about the French and Indian War. We finished that up. Where did what were the three causes? Caleb? Land, fishing, and trade. Those were the fur trade, but trade. We looked at the Ohio Valley, the initial onslaught of activity there. Then William Pitt coming in as prime minister. What are some changes he made?
He got rid of old generals.
Yep, got rid of the older, not so much, the older incompetent generals, the ones who refused to adjust to the modern world at that point. Gregory?
He beefed up and supplied the colonial troops.
Yeah, beefed up and supplied the colonial troops. Began to pay for their weaponry, pay for tents, pay for equipment, that type of thing.
The ranks was no longer.
I'm sorry?
Their ranks were no longer based out of where they came from.
Yeah, the British officers weren't automatically superior to the colonial officers. Balance that out. So, and we see that turning things around and England winning. All right, then we started into last time the colonial government, just really an overview of the government structure in the colonies. There's 13 of them. We're not going to bore ourselves by looking at all 13, but we'll do some generalities of the types of things that were happening there. The first thing we saw was the different types of colonies: royal, proprietary, self-governing. Okay. Then we saw the precedent of things being written down, right? Even much more significant in the colonies than it was in England at that time. And then we saw the British authority in the colonies and a dispute about how far that extended, or at least maybe which parts of Great Britain had authority in the colonies. And can somebody tell me about that dispute? Yes?
The people listen to the king but not Parliament.
The people, which people? In the colonies.
Yeah.
Okay, the colonies, they very readily acknowledged the king, but they did not acknowledge Parliament. In England, it was much the opposite. They felt the colonies should listen to both the king and Parliament. Okay, and what was at the heart of the issue with Parliament? Why would the colonists say they shouldn't listen to Parliament? Stephanie? No representation there, which I think is very fair, even if you take the different view of representation that they had in England. There's no representation there. Okay, so the British authority, we see that in time becomes an issue with taxation. All right, the next thing to mention is colonial legislatures. Each colony had its own legislative body. I want to just briefly talk about them. First point is that all but one of them were bicameral legislatures. What does that mean, bicameral? Caleb's squinting at me. As opposed to unicameral. So we're talking about two of something. Yes? Morgan. That's two houses. Two parts of the legislature. For America, we have a House and a Senate. Does Canada have a bicameral? Okay. Maybe have a tricameral? We got three. So bicameral legislature. There was an upper and a lower house. The names changed a little bit, but all of them bicameral except for one, and it's the colony that became a state that is still has this mark of strangeness to it today. Stephanie looked like she knew. No. I think. Nobody? Okay. Pennsylvania was the one. So any Pennsylvania? Here a little bit. You lived in Pennsylvania? Oh, I thought you raised your hand. All right, so Pennsylvania, that's what happened. I lived in Pennsylvania. So, all right, so bicameral. I want to very, very quickly just talk about the upper and lower houses, these two pieces of it. All of them, but that one had a bicameral. The upper house, in all these cases, was smaller in number and also less powerful. It did not have, it was not the most powerful side. Again, there have been variations from colony to colony, but the upper house was smaller and less powerful. I should probably give you one other description of the upper house. Is it also very intentionally was the representation of the upper classes, the aristocratic elements of society. It was the upper house. parallel somewhat to the House of Lords in Great Britain. Okay, then the other side, the lower house, which would be comparable with the House of Commons, if you're familiar with that in Great Britain. The lower house, this one did represent the common people. It was, all of the citizens that were guys got to vote. Depending on the colonies, between 50 and 75% of the adult males that lived in the colony were actually citizens and got to vote, which is a very high number. You might think today, oh wow, that seems kind of bad. But at that point, that was a very high percentage of involvement of the population. Okay, so it represented the lower house, the common classes. Many of them got to vote, the adult men. And then this also was the most powerful. If the upper house was the weaker, then this one has to be more powerful because there's only two. But it was the most powerful of the two. And let me give you a couple of examples of some of the powers that they had that gave them this authority. The first one, I think the most direct and obvious to see is they controlled taxing and spending. You could list those as two separate things really, but often we just list them together, taxing and spending. If there was going to be a new tax, it had to start here. If there was going to be spending, it had to start here. Right. The king couldn't. The governor couldn't arbitrarily just raise taxes or decide to spend money. It had to be approved by this lower house. All right. So that's a very significant power. We'll come back to that in a second. Another one that might not be quite so obvious is this house got to redraw the districts for representation. All right. This is something that can be tremendously abused. And they got to control it themselves. It could still be abused, but at least they were the ones controlling it. Right? If let's pretend this is a state, and those three dots are major cities. Okay, and we're going to split it up into let's say 5 districts for representation. You could kind of take, half of this city with the big swath of the countryside so that the people in the city don't have enough votes to outweigh the countryside. Okay? Or you could, take a big hunk of the countryside with the whole city, and that would throw the population of the city being large enough to outweigh the entire countryside. And depending on which political party got to draw the districts and which political persuasion the cities and the countryside were, right, you can skew things heavily in your favor. Okay? And this lower house got to do this themselves. The governor didn't do it. The courts didn't do it. The king didn't do it. They got to do this themselves. So it seems like not especially significant sometimes, but this can be tremendously abused. It has been through American history. Even I think it's appropriate for the legislature to do it, but it's even been abused in American history. Anybody know the term used for drawing districts to give your political party advantage? It comes out of the governor of New York, I believe it was. His name was Elbridge Gerry. You're smiling. Oh. Gerrymandering, right? He drew some districts that are really, really strange. And somebody said, that looks like a salamander. And someone else said, oh, no, it's a gerrymander. That's where it came from. So anyway, it's been abused in American history, but it really, you can give your political party tremendous advantage doing this. And this at least took that out of the hands of the governor. This lower house controlled it themselves. So. I used to live a little bit west of here, and my district was connected with the whole east side of Gary. So there's this little sliver across Gary and then where I lived. And I used to get mail from my representative in Indianapolis that said the Gary representative. And I lived here in Porter. But there was intentionally this little sliver across the lake and then a population here with this big hunk of Gary. There weren't enough votes here to outweigh the liberal votes in Gary. So it was the Gary representative, guy with an earring. I was really proud of him. You remember his name? Charlie Brown, even appropriate names. Okay, so anyway, they control those districts. So anyway, that one That one might be a little bit hard to see, but the taxing and spending, I think that one's pretty obvious. Controlling that gives them tremendous power in government. All right, legislatures. Now the colonial governor, real quick about him. Just two main points about the colonial governor. The first one is that on paper, in theory, this guy was very, very powerful. His authority would have varied somewhat from state to state, but generally speaking, he had things like this at his disposal. He could summon or dismiss the legislature at will. He could force the state, or at this point, colonial legislature to come in, or he could just send them home and they were done. There's nothing they could do. He had an absolute veto. They passed some law, he vetoes it. There's no way they can't override the veto like the Constitution has today. He was in charge of the military and often also in charge of the state church. Some of the colonies didn't have established churches, but he was in charge of the church. So he had those types of powers, very large, significant powers. Oh, looked like you had a question.
Who was this?
The governor, the colonial governor. Okay, so I said it on paper or in theory, he has lots and lots of power. Those are some significant powers, okay? When it actually came time to practice, the actual mechanics of government, the lower house typically had the advantage. Can anybody think what power that the lower house had would give it the advantage? There's not too many that we listed, so Joseph?
Power of taxing.
Yeah, power of taxing and spending. All right, the governor couldn't arbitrarily spend anything. It had to be approved by the lower house. So they literally, in cases, would not approve the governor's salary until they had covered everything else that they wanted to do. That way, if the governor got mad and suspended the legislature, he never got paid. Okay. So they used that power very, very well. Again, it was not that the governor was not insignificant, but very often here the lower house with that power over spending and taxing gave them leverage to at least make the governor consider them and listen to them somewhat. So, when we get to the time of the American Revolution and afterwards the writing of the Declaration, wow, that comes before the Revolution. When we get to the Constitution afterwards, it's often described, the men writing the Constitution, as being a very capable, very special group of men, and I think they were. One of the things that made them especially fitted for doing that was they had been involved in government structures like this, where they had seen how different powers and privileges that leaders could have could be used to wield power. And there's all kinds of things in the Constitution that keep the president in check from abusing his power and keep the legislature in check. There's all kinds of things that are built in there that you can see, wow, these guys are experienced. They weren't just, some useless college professor sitting in his office thinking, and I say that partly in jest. College professors are not useless, I hope. But anyway, some professor who had never done anything sitting in his office thinking, oh, this is how government should operate. They had actually been in the trenches and seen power abused. So they built lots of things in there. So it's a very, very, very good document. Not just because of that, but that is a contributing factor. Okay, colonial governors. Questions on that? Or the colonial legislatures or any of that? You guys look especially dead today. Most days you're just, half dead or something, but I don't know. Zachary's answered some questions. Justin worked all night? No? No excuses. All right, well, let's see if we can get some people here to answer some questions. The next thing we'll talk about is the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. Okay, this thing comes along. Well, I don't need to tell you. I already have. When was the Great Awakening? It's on the timeline. If you're thinking, he didn't tell us that. It's on the timeline. You forgot? Somebody remind us, when's the Great Awakening? Joseph knows. Joanna? Yeah, 1730s and 40s is when we see the Great Awakening. Really just just prior to the Declaration of Independence and the whole wave of events that prepare us for independence. So right prior to that, we have the Great Awakening. We could spend lots and lots of time on this. I don't want to do that, but there are some significant things here that we need to look at. Even secular historians look back and recognize the Great Awakening as an entity that changed America. So it's not just, that sounds bad. It's not just Christians who look back and are trying to, make this a bigger deal than it was. It really did change America, more than just America. It was a significant phenomenon. So we need to look at it. All right, the Great Awakening. The first thing I have to look at is a need for revival. Why do we need this awakening? What caused it? I've got three reasons here. Somewhat arbitrary a little bit, but three reasons. The first one is the combined church and state. Most colonies had some sort of combined church and state. We see as we get closer to independence, a lot of them getting rid of that and losing it. But most of the colonial time frame, there was combined church and states, most places. That always produces a cold, dead church. Can anybody think how or why would that happen? Stephanie can. Anybody else? Let me change the question. What if we lobbied the Indiana legislature and made it a requirement to be a member of Fairhaven Baptist Church in order to vote in Indiana? How would that produce a cold, dead church? So, yes?
People would feel like they had to come.
Yes. People would feel like they had to come. So people would come, they would go down front, talk to Dr. Vogelin, they would lie about, I got saved and get baptized, and they'd be members of the church, and they would go vote for governor. And what else could they then vote for? When some woman wants to be the pastor, they could vote for that. So when you have a combined church and state, it forces people to partake, be part of the church. All right, and then you have the next two cases here, but anyway, combined church and state, that always leads to a cold, dead, formal, ritualistic church. So that contributed here. All right. Second reason was there were a lot of unconverted church members. I just mentioned how we could get some of those by the membership requirement to vote and that type of thing. But there was a lot of church members who were saved, who had children, who weren't saved and never really joined the church. So they began to reach out to these people and encourage them to be members of the church, even though they never really claimed to be saved. All right. There's a couple of, or at least one famous example of this. Comes way back from 1662. It's called the Halfway Covenant in New England. And what it did is it allowed children of members to be members of the church, regardless of claiming to be saved or anything. Okay, so we had a lot of unsaved church members. The combined church and state would have contributed to that as well. There's another guy, Reverend Stoddard. He actually argued that by allowing unsaved people to be members, it made it easier to try to convert them. I don't know. It's like saying maybe, if we let illegal aliens vote, it makes it easier to teach them how America works. It's getting backwards. It's not the right way. Speaking of illegal aliens, California and a couple of states have allowed them to get licenses. Okay, California just recently, within a month or so, has made it so when you get your license or renew your license, you're automatically registered to vote. And the government there has said, we don't have any adequate safeguards here to make sure people are legal residents or citizens that get registered to vote. So it's very likely anybody that goes to renew their license is going to get registered to vote. Which could have been the schema. Aren't we stupid, Caleb? You're allowed to say that. You guys are stupid, We can't argue with you. So. All right, so unconverted church members. And then the third one, unconverted church members. The third one is unconverted ministers. There were pastors who weren't saved. I'm trying to find it here. Oh, there's one of the early ministers in the Great Awakening. He preached a sermon called On the Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry. You know, imagine preaching conference this next spring, and Pastor Damon gets up and talks about all you dirty pastors out there that aren't saved. How dare you be a pastor? What? You know, a sermon about the dangers of having pastors who aren't saved. All right, so anyway, unconverted ministers. Let me read you a quote here. This is from a historian of Connecticut. He said this: the forms of religion were kept up, but there appeared but little of the power of it. It seems also to appear that many of the clergy, instead of clearly and powerfully preaching the doctrines of original sin, regeneration, justification by faith alone, contented themselves with preaching a cold, unprincipled, lifeless morality. You know, just be a good person. Not that the morality comes from God and what He teaches. Just be a good person, divorce them too. So anyway, unconverted ministry, pastors who weren't especially concerned about salvation. So anyway, the whole point, there was a need for this revival. Things had gotten cold and dead in the churches, and there was a need for it. All right, so that's the first point. Second point is just a little bit about the awakening getting started, and then the last thing we'll look at is some of the famous men of it, and we'll more just mention a couple of the names here, not go into great detail into the ministries. All right, the start of this Great Awakening. We have the 1730s and 40s in our timeline. So the beginnings of it are around 1730. It's not like a flood where you can say, all right, today is when the flood came. But anyway, around 1730, we can begin to see some things changing. Right. In America, one of the earlier denominations, if you want to call it that began to really experience some things was the Dutch Reformed Church. That goes back into the late 20s even. There's some guy named Theodore Fraglinghuisen, and I might be saying that wrong, began to be an influential preacher there. A little bit after him, and one that becomes more significant in the broader realm, is the Presbyterian Church. They began to experience some revival. The one preacher who becomes very important early on is a man named William Tennent, Tennent, William Tennent. He starts a college for ministers. There were already some colleges established, but they were cold and dead and formal and, you know, producing ministers who weren't saved. So he starts a separate college in 1736. It's just called the Log Cabin College. In the backwoods of Pennsylvania. It was in a log cabin, literally. So he begins to train ministers who are actually saved and fervent and dedicated to God. So it was his son that preached that sermon on the dangers of an unconverted ministry. So if William Tennent, come along, it was about 1736 that he starts that college. And then from that point on, we see this Great Awakening spreading through the colonies. If you had to pick a couple of years that we see the greatest effects, it would be 1740 through 43. In that 3-year span, basically, there are between 30 and 40,000 people saved. It's hard to measure some of those things. Hundreds of churches that are affected. You know, that would kind of be the heart of it. Before that, we see it building up. We see that being the heart. And then the effects continue on afterwards. So. All right, so 1730s and 40s, we see this religious revival, a true religious revival sweeping the nation. All right, last thing I want to do with the Great Awakening is mention some of the famous men. These mostly, I think you'll be, I'm sorry, it's not the last thing. There are two more things. Great famous men and then some of the results we need to look at. All right, some of the famous men. The first one is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards. All right, went to Yale at 13. How many are behind a little bit? Wow, my daughter Emily's 13 at Yale. Anyway, he didn't get saved actually until he got to Yale. He went there to train as a minister, got saved while he was there. And he graduates, becomes a pastor, and becomes a very powerful preacher of the Great Awakening. Anybody know one of his famous sermons? Probably his most famous sermon? Yes. Yeah, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which he read very monotone and dull. It talked about people being suspended over hell by a spider web, and just the least little thing would sever that spider web and would go plunging into hell. And hundreds of people got saved through that sermon that he would just read, just written out and he would read it. So. All right, so Jonathan Edwards, he lives up through 1758, if you want some years on that one. All right, another guy, John Wesley. He's across the ocean in England. And a very famous preacher over there. He actually lives till 1791, lives much longer. And the one last one to mention here is George Whitefield. George Whitefield. He's referred to as the most powerful preacher of the Great Awakening. It was said that he preached to crowds of 20,000, which is hard to. There's no PA system. We could put about 2,000 in our auditorium. Whatever the case was, extremely powerful voice. Benjamin Franklin went to hear him preach once. And there's two interesting things about this. First of all, he was preaching open air, and he went back as far as he could to where he could still hear clearly. And then just measured the distance and made a circle and assigned, I don't know how much, a certain square footage per person. And he estimated that inside that range, you could fit 30,000 people to hear him speaking out in the open. So, very powerful voice. So, and the other thing, I want to read you a quote by Benjamin Franklin, him describing one of these meetings. Right, so it's talking about this is talking about Whitefield preaching. He was at first permitted to preach in some of the churches. I'm sorry, wrong quote. Here it is. I happened to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with a collection. I silently resolved he should get nothing from me. That's interesting. Have the collection after the sermon. If he doesn't do a good job, we don't throw anything in. So anyway, I resolved he'd get nothing from me. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistols in gold, not firearm coin. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give the silver. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that. I'm sorry, that was the copper. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that and determined to give the silver. He finished so admiringly that I emptied the pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. So that was Franklin's description of one of these sermons. Okay, so George Whitefield, another powerful preacher there. So there's others, a lot of well-known names come out of that awakening.
John Wesley is the one that sent the letter to William Wilberforce.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, John Charles Wesley are definitely involved
About when William Wilberforce was dealing
with slavery.
it's failing, or John Wesley encouraged him, right?
Probably. Okay, this sounds good. We'll go with it. All right, last thing for the Great Awakening I want to list here is some results of this awakening. What do we get out of this thing? All right, the first one, I just have listed spiritual results. It was a real religious awakening. People get saved, people get right, churches are started, missionaries are sent. David Brainerd was one of those missionaries. A whole slew of real religious revival. All right, so we have that. I'm not trying to discount that, but there's some other things that we do get out of this. So we get the spiritual results. The second thing is there are some colleges that are started as a direct result of this thing. These colleges started to train ministers. They've strayed far from that today. All right, places like Princeton and Brown University. But anyway, those were started. So we have college education. Another result is lower levels of education, what we think of as elementary and high school levels of education. There's a wave of schools being started, both grammar, elementary, as well as high school. Without dictates from the government. These are privately begun entities. Okay, fourth thing is this helped establish the separation of church and state. Okay, we saw even for the time in the colonies, especially the early times, that was the norm, a combined church and state. Right? The spreading of true religion and true understanding of the Bible pushed us away from a combined church and state. Jefferson said, "It is error alone which needs the support of government. The truth can stand by itself." You know, the church will be fine as long as it's based in the truth. So, and then the last result is increasing political freedom. All right. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes here. The first one is from a book called Persecution by David Limbaugh, Rush Limbaugh's brother. A guy named Paul Johnson states the first one. Here it is. "It could be argued that it was in the 18th century, which is the 1700s, the 18th century, we're right in the middle of that the specifically American form of Christianity, undogmatic, moralistic rather than creedal, tolerant but strong, and all-pervasive of society was born, and that the Great Awakening was its midwife," recognizing the effect that this had. Paul Johnson also said that the Great Awakening proved to be of vast significance both in religion and in politics. It had a tremendous effect in politics as well. And then Calvin Coolidge made a statement. Anybody know that name? Everybody but our foreign students should know that name. Who was he? If you're really warped and demented, he wasn't Hobbes' friend. Anybody ever read Calvin and Hobbes? Okay. It wasn't him. So, who wants this one? Who else wants this one? You got to get a new hand, you know, like a rubber chicken, or you know. Calvin Coolidge, great orator, member of Senate, Supreme Court Chief Justice. President of the United States, okay, in the 1920s. This is what he said. Just imagine hearing the president say these things. All right, the American Revolution was preceded by the great religious revival of the middle of the 18th century, 1700s, the Great Awakening, which had its effect both in England and in the colonies. When the common people turned to the reading of the Bible, when they were stirred by a great revival, the way was prepared. It was because religion gave the people a new importance and a new glory that they demanded new freedom and a new government. We cannot, in our generation, this is the 1920s, reject the cause and retain the results. The cause was Christianity. We can't reject that and retain the results. Goes on, if the institutions they adopted are to survive, if the governments which they founded are to endure, it will be because the people continue to have similar religious beliefs. It is idle to discuss freedom and equality on any other basis. It is useless to expect substantial reforms from any other motive. They cannot be administered from without, they must come from within. And then I'll skip a little bit. It is these beliefs, these religious convictions that represent the strength of America, the strength of all civilized society. It is righteousness alone which exalteth the nation. Now, I can see our president talking about that way about Islam, possibly. Right? But he's talking about Christianity, biblical Christianity is what he's talking about, and how our whole system was founded and based upon the people being Christian. Right? We are seeing that gone, disappearing, and we're going to see the structure of the government following. We might still have a president and a Senate and a House, but the structure is rapidly degenerating. So, all right, Great Awakening. Questions there? Calvin Coolidge is one of my all-time favorite presidents. So, Stephanie likes him because of all the socks he had ready for his wife. I forget the number. He had 43 pairs of socks or something with holes in them when he got married. And someone said, "Did you get married just to get your socks fixed?" And he says, "No, but it really is convenient." Must have been saving them for years. I don't know. So, he is very known for little short one-line humorous statements. and also very, very, anyway, very good president. We will get there later, next semester. We'll talk about Calvin Coolidge. All right, mercantilism. We have just two more things to talk about, and then we'll get to the build-up events to the War for Independence. So we're here still kind of in this colonial time frame, talked about the governors and the legislatures, talked about the Great Awakening. Now mercantilism, and then the last thing we'll talk about, which probably won't be today, is we'll talk about some things that changed the way the colonists thought politically. One of them is the Great Awakening, but there's some other things. The colonists have a very different view of government than even England did at the time. So we'll talk about that. All right, mercantilism. Let me give you just a simple definition of this thing. It can be a hard thing to grab because it was very fluid, depending upon a little bit what time frame you're talking about and which country you're talking about. There's a very general idea that has lots of different particulars in different places. So let me give you the general idea. All right, and as we talk about this, don't forget the general idea of what this is. Okay, so here's a very, very basic definition. Mercantilism. It's political control over the economy. That's the way to think of it. Political control over the economy. I'm going to give you some other things here with the definition, but that's the heart of it. Political control over the economy. They get to some things that we look at and think, well, that's kind of strange. If you take their definition of mercantilism and the underlying assumptions, the things make sense. The underlying assumptions are false, but if you start at this wrong point, they do make sense. So I want us to try to understand a little bit of the thinking, and then we'll look at some of the particulars. So the basic definition, political control, that's at the heart of it. The government controlling things in the economy, dictating who gets to do what, how things are done, who gets paid, who doesn't get paid, what gets made, what doesn't get made. Political control, government control. You could throw it into that came category. The same category as socialism, communism, that type of thing. All those are just different forms of political control. So, all right, let me give you a couple of other thoughts here underneath that basic idea, political control over the economy. Here's some other things that go along with that idea, but that is the main idea. The first one here is that the wealth of a country is only measured in the gold and silver that they possess. Just count the amount of gold and silver. You know, how many pounds of gold here, how many pounds of silver there, or tons of gold, tons of silver. All we're looking at is the gold and silver. All right, or you could generalize it possibly more to just money. The only way we count wealth is by measuring money. Can anybody think of an error there, possibly? Yeah, the problem with that, is it really true that the only way to measure wealth, if we say, how much are you worth? We have to open up your wallet and say, oh, it's worth $10. That's it.
With the governmental aspect, they can keep printing money, so you can't really base it.
Okay, we do have the keep print, especially today. At this point, they're actually measuring with gold, so it's hard to print gold. Maybe if they had 3D printers and a nice can of spray paint. So, yes. Okay, what do you mean by that?
Like the value of the country. Like oil.
Okay, yes, there's all kinds of other things that are valuable, okay? If I asked you how much, or if you asked me how much I'm worth, if you looked at the actual cash, I'm pretty hard up. But I got $30. I owe it to somebody though, so it's really not mine. All right. You could look up the actual cash I have. But if you really want to think of how much am I worth, you could talk about my house, talk about my car, talk about the furniture in my house. If we were in another civilization, you could talk about how much my children would be worth. The furniture in my house, the computers, all that my wife's jewelry, all of that stuff would contribute to the amount of wealth or how much I'd be worth. Okay, so here they're saying we're just going to talk about the money. That's it, just the gold and silver, and that's not looking at the complete picture. So, okay, another thought here underneath this basic idea is that the amount of wealth was fixed, so that if somebody gained money, someone else had to lose it. There's always a winner and a loser. There's a fixed amount of money, fixed amount of wealth. So if England is getting wealthy by some activity, then the person they're involved with is somehow losing wealth. Okay? Now, is that true? Morgan saying no? I think it was a very subtle shake of the head. So, how many agree with Morgan? What's that?
What was the question again? Is it true that
Is it really true that there's a fixed amount of wealth, and then in any transaction somebody's losing and somebody's gaining? Just saying no. No, it's not true. Okay, it's not true. I mean, you can dig into the ground and find more gold, and all of a sudden there's more wealth. It's not true. Okay, when you go to Walmart or Meijer or whatever store you go to, Wally World. All right, when you go there and buy something, all right, you're giving them money, but you're getting something back. It's unless you're foolish, you don't come out on the short end of the deal. All right, it's an even exchange at least. All right, so this idea that there's always got to be a winner and a loser, that's not necessarily true when you're talking about business transactions and things like that. People in a business world, they go into some transaction, both sides think they're going to make money. I mean, one of them might be wrong, but both sides go and think they're going to make money, and in many cases, both do. All right? Think of, I don't know, if you're a manufacturing plant and you hire FedEx to ship all of your products, you're giving money to FedEx, but you're making money by giving money to FedEx as you're selling your products. It's both FedEx and the manufacturing company are making money. So it's the false premise that somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. But that's one of the false premises that they base their whole philosophy here of mercantilism on. So one was only measure the gold and silver. Second, there's got to be a winner and a loser. There's not possible here to have both sides profiting. Okay, one other thing here to mention, which I kind of already stated, is it wasn't a set theory. This mercantilistic idea was used by England, it was used by France, it was used by Spain, but we get variations of it in each one of those and different sets of laws and different intents of the laws, but so a lot of variation. Okay. Definition. Okay. Whatever happens, you want to remember political control over the economy. When at some point in the future, if I happen to ask you about mercantilism, okay, that thought should scream at you. Political control over the economy. I've stressed that because it's easy to lose yourself in the weeds here. We're going to look at some examples of particular laws that were passed, and those are useful and good, but don't forget the original idea. It's the government controlling the economy. That's what's at the heart of it. So, okay, the next thing we want to do is look at some examples of mercantilistic practices. Maybe I can come up with a better word. And then we'll look at some examples of some particular mercantilistic laws. So practices, these would be general things that mercantilistic philosophers and ideas that would be pushed. And then we'll look at some particular laws that were passed. Right? So some general practices and then some particular laws. So some general practices. All right, the first one we'll look at is a favorable balance of trade. Favorable balance of trade. How many have heard, of our trade deficit? Have you heard of something like that today, a trade deficit? Or wow, Mr. Joanna saying yes? Okay, yeah. It's a dinosaur from mercantilism, okay, and it needs to die like all the other dinosaurs. It's an albatross that needs to go. So, favorable balance of trade. This is the basic thought: is that a country has this favorable balance of trade if it sells more to other countries than it gets from them. It sells more. Believes. All right, let's use us, the U.S., and Belize. All right, if we have a favorable balance of trade, we're selling more to them than they're selling to us. So let's say we sell to them $1 million worth of products, but we get $1 million. And we buy from them, just to use some nice numbers, $500,000. That leaves us with a $500,000 trade surplus, a favorable balance of trade. Okay? To think that through the way they did, you want to follow where the money ends up. Okay? After all the transactions are done, we have $500,000 more dollars than we had before. Okay? Can anybody think what's missing in that analysis? Yeah, there's actual products that are being traded. Right? You guys gave us $1 million worth of products. I'm sorry, you gave us $1 million, but we lost $1 million worth of products. Right? Right, so that's never falls into the equation here by mercantilistic thinking. All right, it's faulty thinking. They never follow the product. So really, by today's standards, you have real products. I was going to say that work, but if they're made in America today, they may not work. But let's pretend that they work. All right, real products. And we have our own fake money. I mean, what's that?
Already sort of do.
I know, but we're giving a real product, let's say a new computer to them, and we get back for it fake money. Right. By that analysis, you guys, sure, we'll take all this fake money. We'll take some real products. Right? So, but anyway, the point is, by mercantilistic thinking, you don't follow the products. We're not worried about that. We're just tracking the money. Again, it goes back to that idea of the only really way to measure a country's wealth is by the gold and silver. Right? So they want to have this favorable balance of trade so that they're continually getting more gold and silver. It's a faulty way to look at things. It's faulty today to look at it this way, and it's a dinosaur from this. Okay, so favorable balance of trade. So countries will look at some laws and things that they do trying to organize that. So, all right, another example here of a practice is promotion of manufacturing. They would do certain things to encourage people to manufacture products within their country. Okay. If you have something to trade, it's got to be manufactured somehow. That was the thinking. So they did things like give direct subsidies to people. Be like our government. I shouldn't say this because they might do it. Wanting to encourage the manufacture of computers. So they go to Apple and say, we're going to give you $100 for every laptop you make, just straight cash. Right? They did things not with laptops, but they would go to people making rope for ships or tar for ships, and just give them money. You make this and sell it in our colony, we'll give you so much cash on top of it. All right, things like that, to having contests so you can make the best of a certain product and encouraging manufacturing that way. Just all kinds of different ways trying to promote manufacturing. All right, that was another practice. A third practice is promotion of shipping. Promotion of shipping. They would encourage shipbuilding and their citizens to own ships and get involved with trade. All of those really were, both of those, the manufacturing and the trade, the shipping, were ways to encourage that balance of trade. So, all right, two more to look at here. The next one we've already looked at, but I should probably give you a name for it. It's called bullionism. Bullion, B-U-L-L-I-O-N, like gold bullion, bullionism. And that's B-U-L-L-I-O-N, bullionism. That's the idea about the gold and silver being the only thing that you track wealth with. You don't actually track products and goods or natural resources. It's just the gold and silver. That is bullionism. Okay. One last just general practice is planting colonies. This was seen as a mercantilistic endeavor, at least in part. We know some colonies were started for religious freedom and other things, but in part, it was a mercantilistic endeavor. For several reasons. You don't have to write these all down necessarily, but some of the thinking was that the colonies might have access to, to raw material that things could be produced from, and then that would encourage manufacturing and shipping. Sometimes the colonies were looked at as a market for the mother country to sell their products in. So anyway, promotion of colonies, planting of colonies was looked at as a mercantilistic idea. I thought we would get done. So the last thing we want to do, and I think I'll have to say this for next time, is look at some particular mercantilistic laws. We'll look at some laws passed by England and how they were applied to the colonies that were mercantilistic. We will also, after that, look at a couple of colonial laws. For a lot of the colonial time frame, the colonists didn't like, they weren't against mercantilism. They wanted to be included in that circle of people that the gold and silver was getting brought to. Right? They were upset with the way England was applying it. They kind of liked the idea. In fact, they apply it in the colonies themselves on a different scale. So we'll look at some examples of mercantilism in the colonies as well. There's a very famous man who writes a book attacking mercantilism. Somebody else. That becomes extremely influential and it affects our founding tremendously because it causes our founding fathers to rethink the way an economy should operate. Nobody knows? Just one? He wrote about wealthy nations. Thomas acts like he should know. He should. An inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And the author, Adam Smith. Anybody know that name? Of course, Adam Smith. He attacked this whole idea of mercantilism. All right, and we get out of that a free market system, which is really a biblical model for an economy. So we don't. Once we get to the Declaration and especially to the Constitution, this idea no longer dominates in America. It's a free market ideology that dominates. So, all right, we will finish this up next time. You're dismissed.